I was 15 years old when my mother left me in the middle of the woods during a storm and told me I was a burden she had been too afraid to throw away. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She just looked at me, rain already streaking down the windshield, and said it like a conclusion she'd reached long ago. Get out. I stood there for a second, stunned, my hand still on the door handle, convinced this was some kind of test. I had no phone, no money, no jacket thick enough for the cold that was already seeping into my bones. The trees around us were tall and unfamiliar, their branches swaying violently in the wind. I didn't even know where we were. I believed, foolishly, that she would change her mind, that she would wait a minute, that she would let the anger burn off and tell me to get back in the car. Instead, she watched me step onto the wet ground, close the door from inside, locked it, and drove away without looking back. 2 days later, the police called my family to the hospital. I was found unconscious, barely alive, and when my mother walked into that room and saw who was sitting beside my bed, her entire body started to shake. I didn't know it then, but that moment would become the first time in my life that the truth stood taller than her lies. That night in the woods wasn't just the most terrifying night of my life. It was the night everything I believed about family finally collapsed. I'm 26 now, and I can still feel the cold of that rain in my bones when I think about it. Not because of the weather, but because of what it meant to be left behind by the one person who was supposed to protect me. People like to believe these things happen suddenly, in a flash of uncontrollable anger. They don't. What happened to me that night didn't start in the woods. It started long before, inside our house, in ways that were quieter and easier to explain away. When I stepped out of the car, I didn't run. I didn't scream. I didn't chase after her. I stood there, frozen, listening to the engine fade into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, but I didn't move. I kept telling myself this wasn't real yet, that this was just another one of her punishments. I had learned early on that in our family, punishment didn't always come with raised voices. Sometimes it came with silence. Sometimes it came with disappointment. And sometimes it came with being treated like you were too much trouble to keep dealing with. I waited because waiting felt safer than accepting the truth. Waiting meant there was still a chance she'd come back. The woods around me were dark and unfamiliar, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees, branches cracking and leaves scattering across the dirt. Every sound felt closer than it was, louder than it should have been. I hugged my arms around myself, trying to keep what little warmth I had left. I told myself to count the minutes. 5, 10, 15. Any second now, I thought. Any second, the headlights would appear through the rain. They didn't. As the rain grew heavier, reality began to sink in, slow and brutal. My mother wasn't coming back. This wasn't a lesson. This wasn't discipline. This was abandonment. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how far the nearest road was. I didn't even know which direction she had driven once she turned off the main highway. All I knew was that standing still wasn't going to keep me alive. So I started walking. I walked deeper into the woods because staying near the road felt dangerous and exposed, and because some part of me still believed she might circle back and find me if I didn't wander too far. That belief clung to me stubbornly, even as my shoes filled with water and my hands began to shake uncontrollably. With every step, the truth pressed harder against my chest. I wasn't lost because I had made a mistake. I was lost because someone had chosen to leave me there. The worst part wasn't the fear of the dark, or the cold, or the sounds I couldn't identify. The worst part was the question that kept repeating in my head, quieter than the storm, but louder than anything else. Why was I so easy to leave? I didn't know yet that the reason I was standing alone in those woods had nothing to do with the kind of daughter I was, and everything to do with the kind of mother she chose to be. I didn't know that a lie had been spoken earlier that evening, carefully crafted by someone who knew exactly how to make her believe it. I only knew that I was 15 years old, soaked to the skin, shaking from cold and shock, and still hoping for footsteps behind me. That hope lasted longer than it should have, because the truth is, I wasn't abandoned for the first time that night. I had been abandoned slowly, quietly, over years. The woods were just the first place my mother did it where no one else could pretend not to see. I didn't know then that I wouldn't wake up where I collapsed. I didn't know who would find me. And I had no idea that the person who would save my life would one day make my mother wish she had never turned that car around. People like to believe my mother snapped that night, that something inside her broke all at once. She didn't. She decided. What happened in the woods began hours earlier, inside our house, in a way that felt ordinary at first. That's what makes it so dangerous. Ordinary cruelty hides easily. My brother had always been the one everyone trusted. He was younger than me, softer in their eyes, the child who needed protecting. If he cried, it meant something terrible had been done to him. If he said something happened, no one questioned it. My mother used to say it proudly, like a compliment. He wouldn't lie, she'd tell people. He's sensitive. He has a good heart. By the time I was 15, I knew better. Not because I thought he was evil, but because I had watched him learn. He had learned which tears worked. He had learned which words made our mother stiffen with fear instead of curiosity. And most importantly, he had learned that if he spoke first, he didn't have to be right. That night started with something small, the way these things always do. Something went wrong. Something that would have meant consequences if the blame landed where it belonged. I don't even remember the object anymore, just the tension that filled the room when my mother realized there was a problem. I was in my room when I heard my name. Not shouted, not angry yet, just sharp enough to make my stomach drop. "Jessica, come here." I walked into the living room already bracing myself. My brother was sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, eyes red. My mother stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. I could tell immediately that whatever had happened, I was already losing. She didn't ask me what I knew. She didn't ask me what happened. She asked me why I did it. I remember blinking at her, genuinely confused. Did what? My brother didn't look at me. He stared at the floor, breathing unevenly, like he was trying to hold himself together. That performance mattered more than any explanation I could have offered. "She knows," he said quietly. "She just won't admit it." Something shifted in my mother's face. Not doubt, disappointment. The kind that hurts more because it feels final. I tried to explain. I talked too fast, too much, listing details, timelines, logic. I told her where I had been. I told her what I hadn't touched. I told her this didn't make sense. She cut me off mid-sentence. "Enough," she said. "Stop lying." The word hit harder than a slap. Lying? Not mistaken, not confused. Lying. I looked at my brother then. Really looked at him, waiting for him to crack, to say something, to admit this had gone too far. He didn't. He stayed silent, eyes still down, hands clenched together like he was holding on to something precious. That silence was the most powerful part of the lie. My mother turned away from me, already done listening. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired of dealing with this, dealing with me." That was when I realized she wasn't trying to understand what happened. She was trying to justify what she was about to do. My brother hadn't just accused me. He had handed her permission. Permission to see me as the problem. Permission to be finished. I followed her into the kitchen, my voice shaking now, desperate. "Please," I said. "You know me. You know I wouldn't." She slammed a cabinet door shut. "I know exactly who you are," she snapped, "and I'm done pretending this isn't a pattern. A pattern." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her to name it, to explain how I had become the problem when every mistake my brother made somehow ended up on my shoulders. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for relief. My brother stayed in the living room. He didn't follow. He didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. When my mother grabbed her keys, I thought we were going for a drive. That had happened before. Long lectures in the car, cold silence, then home again, like nothing had happened. I told myself that was what this was. The rain had just started when we pulled out of the driveway. Light at first, barely noticeable. The kind that makes everything feel heavier without making noise. The car was silent except for the windshield wipers. I kept waiting for her to say something, anything. She didn't. "Where are we going?" I asked finally. "You need time to think," she said, eyes fixed on the road. That answer should have scared me more than it did. But I had spent years learning how to accept vague explanations, how to swallow discomfort, and call it normal. We drove farther than I expected, past familiar streets, past the last gas station. The houses thinned out, replaced by trees and darkness. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass. A small part of me started to panic. "This is far enough," I said quietly. She didn't respond. When the car slowed and turned onto a narrow dirt road, something inside me went cold. Not fear exactly. Recognition. She wasn't teaching me a lesson. She wasn't cooling off. She was done. When she stopped the car, she didn't look at me. She didn't hesitate. She didn't argue. She just said the words like she'd been holding them in for years. "Get out." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, the correction, the part where she told me to stop being dramatic and get back in. It never came. In that moment, I understood something I had been too young to name before. The lie hadn't created this outcome. It had only accelerated it. My brother hadn't destroyed my place in that family. He had exposed how fragile it already was. When I stepped out of the car and the door closed behind me, I still believed she would change her mind. That belief followed me into the rain, into the woods, into the long hours that came next. It took me far too long to accept that my mother hadn't lost control that night. She had finally used it. People think the lie was the problem. It wasn't. The problem was the house I grew up in, the one that taught me how to disappear long before I ever learned how to fight back. From the outside, we looked normal. Clean rooms, hot meals, no bruises anyone could point to. That made everything easier to excuse. When nothing looks broken, no one believes you when you say something is. I was the older one. That fact shaped everything. Being older meant I was expected to understand, to give in, to smooth things over. When my brother cried, my mother rushed to him. When I stayed quiet, she called it maturity. At first, I was proud of that. I thought being low maintenance meant being loved. I learned quickly that love in our house came with conditions. If my brother needed help, I was told to wait. If he was upset, I was told to be patient. If he made a mistake, it became a lesson for me about responsibility. "You should know better," my mother would say, as if age made me immune to being hurt. The first time I was blamed for something he did, I was still young enough to believe it was an accident. He had broken something. Nothing valuable, just enough to cause tension. When my mother asked what happened, he looked at me. Just for a second. Then he said my name. I remember the shock more than the punishment. The way my mother's eyes flicked to me without hesitation. The way she sighed, already tired. "Why would you do that?" she asked. I opened my mouth, ready to explain, but she waved me off. "I don't want excuses." I was grounded, he wasn't. That should have been the moment I spoke up, pushed back, demanded fairness. Instead, I swallowed it. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was easier to take the blame than to create conflict. I didn't realize I was teaching them something. I was teaching them I would carry what they didn't want to hold. After that, it happened more often. Little things at first, missing items, messes, stories that didn't quite line up. Every time my brother hesitated, looked unsure, my mother read it as vulnerability. Every time I spoke clearly and calmly, she read it as defensiveness. Silence became my survival skill. I stopped correcting the record. I stopped explaining myself. I learned how to stay neutral, how to nod and move on, how to make myself smaller so the tension would pass quicker. My mother called it improvement. She told people I was difficult before but getting better. Better meant quieter. My brother noticed the shift. He learned that he didn't need to argue or embellish. All he had to do was look scared, look hurt, look like he needed protection. The rest would happen without him lifting a finger. Watching that changed something in me. Not into anger, not yet, but into clarity. I saw how carefully the roles were divided. He was the one who needed understanding. I was the one who needed correction. He was allowed to feel. I was expected to endure. The label stuck before I even knew it existed. When teachers mentioned I seemed withdrawn, my mother said I was moody. When relatives asked why I didn't talk much, she said I was cold. Those words followed me through rooms I wasn't in, shaping how people saw me before I ever spoke. Once someone labels you, they stop listening. There was a moment, years before the woods, when I tried to break the pattern. My brother had lied again, and this time I had proof. I remember standing in the kitchen, hands shaking, explaining everything carefully, step by step. I thought logic would save me. My mother didn't even finish listening. "Why are you making this bigger than it needs to be?" she asked. "You're always causing tension." Causing tension? That was when I understood that truth wasn't the currency in our house. Peace was. And peace meant protecting the person my mother felt most responsible for, even if it came at my expense. From then on, I was the problem that had to be managed, the one who disrupted the balance, the one who made things harder than they needed to be. Every sigh, every sharp look, every "not now" reinforced the same message. I learned to expect less. I learned not to ask. I learned that being invisible hurt less than being accused. By the time I was 15, the distance between my mother and me wasn't new. It was familiar. We spoke, but we didn't connect. We existed in the same space without sharing it. I could feel myself becoming excess, something she tolerated rather than wanted. So when my brother lied that night, the ground had already been prepared. The lie didn't have to work hard. It landed on years of quiet resentment, years of unresolved disappointment, years of a narrative my mother had already accepted. The woods weren't the first place she abandoned me. They were just the first place she did it physically. Sitting in that car, listening to the rain start, I thought about all the times I had waited for her to see me differently. All the moments I had hoped I would finally be enough to keep. I didn't know yet that I had been leaving that house long before the car ever turned onto that dirt road. By the time my mother drove me into the woods, the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, not in anger, but slowly, over years. And I was the only one who hadn't realized it yet. I sat in the passenger seat while my mother drove, convinced this was still a punishment and not a goodbye. That belief was the only thing keeping me upright. The car smelled like wet fabric and old coffee. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm, back and forth, as the rain picked up. I watched the road disappear beneath us, familiar streets giving way to darker stretches of pavement. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. Silence was something we both knew how to use. I told myself this was just one of her long drives, the kind where she let the quiet do the scolding. The kind that ended with us turning around and pretending nothing had happened. I had been here before, emotionally, if not geographically. When I finally asked, "Where are we going?" my voice sounded smaller than I expected. She didn't look at me. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You need time to think," she said. That answer should have stopped me cold. Instead, I nodded like it made sense. I had learned to accept vague explanations because pushing for clarity usually made things worse. Clarity required accountability. The rain grew heavier as we drove farther from town. Streetlights thinned out, then vanished entirely. Trees replaced houses, their dark shapes pressing in on both sides of the road. The car's headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the night. Something in my chest started to ache. "This is far enough," I said quietly. She didn't respond. The road narrowed, pavement turning to gravel, then dirt. The sound under the tires changed, rougher, louder. My stomach tightened. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how far we were from anything I recognized. She turned onto a road I had never seen before. No signs, no lights, just trees and rain and darkness. When the car slowed, my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it over the storm. She pulled over without ceremony, tires sinking slightly into the wet ground. She put the car in park and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had said all night. I waited for her to turn toward me, to explain, to tell me this was a scare tactic, to say she'd gone too far. She didn't. Instead, she reached for the door handle on my side and unlocked it. "Get out," she said. Not loudly, not angrily, just firmly, like a directive she expected me to follow. I stared at her, my mind scrambling for the right response. "It's raining," I said stupidly, as if she hadn't noticed, as if the weather might change her mind. "I know," she replied. I looked past her, out at the woods. The trees were tall and close together, their branches swaying in the wind. Rain hit the roof of the car in heavy sheets. I couldn't see a road beyond the one we were on. I couldn't see anything that looked safe. "Please," I said, "just let me think it home." She exhaled sharply, finally turning to look at me. There was no softness in her eyes, no doubt, only exhaustion and something colder beneath it. "I'm done," she said. "I'm too tired to keep dealing with you." The words didn't register all at once. They landed slowly, one by one, each one heavier than the last. I opened the door because I didn't know what else to do. The rain hit me immediately, cold and unforgiving. My shoes sank into the wet ground. I stood there, half in, half out of the car, waiting for her to say something that would stop this. She didn't. She pulled the door closed from inside, locked it, and started the engine. For a second, I thought she might hesitate. Look at me, roll down the window, anything. She didn't. The car pulled away, taillights disappearing into the rain, leaving me standing alone in the dark. I didn't move. I stood there, soaked within seconds, my arms wrapped around myself as if that could keep me warm. I listened to the sound of the engine fade, my brain refusing to accept what had just happened. This wasn't real yet, I told myself. She'll turn around. I waited. The rain soaked through my clothes, heavy and cold. My hair plastered itself to my face. Water ran down my back, into my shoes. I sat down on the ground because my legs were shaking too badly to keep standing. Every sound made my head snap up. The wind through the trees, a branch cracking, the distant echo of thunder. Each one carried the same hope. "That's her. She's coming back." Minutes passed. Maybe more. Time felt warped, stretched thin by fear and disbelief. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to make myself smaller, trying to conserve warmth. The truth crept in slowly, like the cold. She wasn't coming back. This wasn't a lesson. This wasn't a mistake. This was abandonment. The realization didn't come with screaming or sobbing. It came with a hollow ache in my chest and a quiet, crushing understanding. I was alone, and the person who put me there had chosen that outcome. Eventually, my body forced me to move. Sitting still wasn't going to keep me alive. I stood up, unsteady, and looked around. The woods pressed in from all sides, unfamiliar and unforgiving. I took a step away from the road, then another, searching for any sign of shelter, any place that felt less exposed. Each step felt heavier than the last. The moment I stopped waiting for my mother was the moment I understood something else. I might not survive the night. The woods felt alive in a way I had never experienced before. Not peaceful, not quiet, alive like something watching, waiting, breathing around me. Rain dripped from every leaf, every branch, soaking the ground until each step threatened to pull my shoes off my feet. I walked with my arms wrapped around myself, teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was dangerous. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wastes energy. I remembered hearing that somewhere. In health class, maybe. In a movie. It didn't matter. I repeated it like a mantra anyway. Stay calm. Think. I had nothing. No phone, no money, no jacket thick enough to matter. The forest floor was uneven, roots and rocks hidden beneath wet leaves. I stumbled more than once, catching myself on tree trunks slick with rain. Each time my heart slammed against my ribs, convinced this fall would be the one that ended everything. I tried to follow the road, staying close enough that I could see the faint outline of it through the trees. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights flashing briefly before disappearing. I raised my arm once, waving, but the rain swallowed the movement. No one slowed down. My thoughts started to drift, sliding into dangerous places. Maybe this was my fault. Maybe I really was the problem. The words my mother had said echoed in my head, sharper than the wind cutting through my clothes. A burden. Too afraid to throw away. I tried to shake them off, but they clung to me, heavy and persistent. I walked until my legs burned and my feet went numb. The cold crept deeper, seeping into my bones. I stopped feeling the rain on my skin. That scared me more than anything else. I needed shelter. I searched for anything that might block the wind. A fallen tree, a rocky outcrop, something. Eventually, I found a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly, surrounded by thick brush. It wasn't much, but it was less exposed than the road. I crouched down, pulling my knees to my chest, pressing my back against a tree trunk. The bark was rough and wet, but it was solid. I focused on my breathing, slow and deliberate, trying to keep myself from shaking apart. Time blurred. The rain never stopped. The darkness felt endless. Every sound made my heart jump, an animal moving nearby, a branch snapping under its own weight. My imagination filled the gaps with worst-case scenarios. I thought about my brother. I wondered if he felt anything at all. Did he ask where I was? Did he feel relieved? The thought hurt more than the cold. At some point, exhaustion took over. Not sleep, not really, but something close to it. My head drooped forward, my thoughts becoming sluggish and unfocused. I jerked awake whenever my body slumped too far, fear snapping me back to awareness. I don't know how long I was there when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not rain. Footsteps. I lifted my head slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The sound came again, closer this time. Deliberate. Human. "Hello?" a voice called out. A woman's voice, calm, steady, cutting through the storm. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat felt locked, my mouth dry despite the rain. I forced myself to stand, my legs wobbling beneath me. "I'm here," I croaked. The sound barely resembled my own voice. A flashlight beam swept across the clearing, blinding me for a second. The light stopped when it landed on me. "Oh my God," the woman said. She rushed toward me, boots splashing through the mud. She was wearing a raincoat, hood pulled low, hair plastered to her face. Her eyes widened as she took me in. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching out but stopping just short of touching me. I don't know," I said. My teeth chattered violently now that adrenaline had kicked in. "I'm cold." She didn't hesitate. She shrugged off her coat and wrapped it around my shoulders, pulling it tight. The warmth was immediate, shocking. I gasped. "Easy," she said gently. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign, almost painful. She guided me toward the road, one careful step at a time. My legs barely cooperated. When I stumbled, she caught me, strong despite her smaller frame. "Where are your parents?" she asked, her voice steady but her grip firm. I shook my head. They left." She stopped walking. Slowly, she turned to look at me, really look at me. Rain streamed down her face, but her eyes were sharp, focused. "They left you here?" I nodded. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, not confusion, anger, controlled, contained, but unmistakable. "We're getting you help," she said, "right now." She led me to her car parked a short distance away. The interior was warm, blessedly dry. She helped me into the passenger seat, wrapped me in a blanket from the back. My body shook uncontrollably as sensation rushed back into my limbs. She got in, started the engine, and turned the heater all the way up. "I'm calling emergency services," she said. "What's your name?" "Jessica," I whispered. "Jessica," she repeated, grounding me. "I'm right here. Stay with me." As the car pulled onto the road, my vision blurred. The warmth was too much. Too fast. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy. The last thing I remember was her voice, firm and reassuring, speaking into her phone. "I found a miner alone in the woods," she said. "She's hypothermic, and she needs help." The first thing I noticed was the smell. Clean, sharp, unfamiliar. Antiseptic. I opened my eyes to white light and the steady beep of a monitor somewhere to my left. My body felt heavy, like it had been filled with sand. When I tried to move, pain bloomed through my limbs and forced a small sound out of my throat. "Easy," a woman's voice said immediately. Calm, close. "Don't try to sit up yet." I turned my head slowly. The room came into focus in pieces. Pale curtains, a hospital bed, and a woman sitting in the chair beside me, hands folded neatly in her lap, posture straight despite the late hour. She looked composed in a way I wasn't used to seeing, not rushed, not frantic, grounded. She wore a tailored coat draped over the back of the chair and practical shoes still dusted with dried mud. Her eyes met mine, steady and assessing. "You're safe," she said. "You've been in and out for a while." Safe. The word landed differently this time. My throat burned when I tried to speak. Where am I?" "In the hospital," she replied. "You were hypothermic, mild concussion, dehydrated. They're running tests, but you're stable." I swallowed. The memory came rushing back in sharp fragments. Rain, trees, cold, the woods. My chest tightened. "You found me," I whispered. She nodded. "Yes." Something about her presence made it easier to breathe. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she didn't pity me. Didn't look away. "I'm Karen Moore," she said. "I was driving home when I saw you near the road. You shouldn't have been out there." I laughed weakly. The sound cracked halfway through. "I know." Her jaw tightened just slightly. "The police will want to ask you some questions," she continued gently, "and a social worker is on the way. They'll explain everything." Panic flared. "Please," I said quickly. "I don't want to go back." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "No one is sending you anywhere tonight." I exhaled, a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Time passed strangely after that. Nurses came and went. Someone shined a light in my eyes. Someone wrapped another blanket around me. Karen didn't leave. She stood when doctors spoke to her, answered questions clearly, confidently, like she belonged there. At some point, I drifted again. I woke to unfamiliar voices, deeper, tense. "She's a minor," a man was saying, "found alone in the woods, 2 days exposure." "I want to speak with her parents," another voice added. "Female, official." My stomach dropped. "I'm here," Karen said, her tone shifting, firmer now. "And I will be present for that conversation." There was a pause. "Who are you to the child?" someone asked. Karen didn't hesitate. "The person who found her, and the person who stayed." Footsteps approached. I turned my head toward the door just as it opened. My mother stepped inside. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair was pulled back hastily, strands loose around her face. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. For a split second, relief flickered across her expression when she saw me in the bed. Then her gaze shifted. It landed on Karen. I watched the moment happen in slow motion. My mother's shoulders stiffened, her breath hitched, her knees visibly buckled before she caught herself on the doorframe. She knew who Karen was. Karen stood from the chair, calm and unmistakably in control. "Mrs. Moore," she said evenly. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands started to shake, not subtly, not something she could hide. Full body tremors she couldn't stop. She tried. "I didn't." "Your daughter was found alone in the wilderness," Karen said, voice sharp now, "hypothermic, injured, without food, water, or a phone." My mother looked at me then, eyes wide. "Jessica, I told you to stay close to the road." she said quickly, desperation creeping in. You must have wandered. No, Karen cut in. The word landed like a gavel. She told me exactly what happened, Karen continued, and she told the police, and she told the social worker who is arriving any moment. My mother's legs gave out. She sank into the nearest chair, hands gripping the armrests as if the room were tilting. This is a misunderstanding, she whispered. My son said, I'm aware of what your son said, Karen replied. I'm also aware of what the physical evidence says. The door opened again. A uniformed officer stepped in, followed by a woman holding a clipboard. The air in the room changed instantly. Mrs. Moore, the officer said, we need to ask you some questions. My mother looked around, searching for something solid. An ally, an explanation that might still save her. Her eyes kept darting back to Karen, like she couldn't reconcile her presence with the story she'd told herself. Karen met her gaze without flinching. You abandoned her, Karen said quietly, and now there are consequences. Tears streamed down my mother's face. She shook her head over and over. I didn't mean it like that. I was angry. I thought... You thought wrong, Karen said. No shouting, no drama. Just truth, spoken clearly, in a room where lies no longer had any power. The social worker approached my bed, her voice gentle as she explained next steps. Temporary placement, protection, time, choices. I listened, numb but strangely calm. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother being led out of the room, her steps unsteady, her shoulders hunched. She didn't look back. Karen returned to the chair beside my bed and sat down again. You did nothing wrong, she said softly. Not then, not now. I stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently into my hair. For the first time since that night in the woods, I believed her. The hospital became a strange kind of in-between place. Not home, not the woods, not the future either. Days blurred together under fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of nurses' footsteps. My body recovered faster than my mind. The bruises faded, the shaking stopped. But every time a door opened, a part of me braced for my mother's face to appear again, tight with excuses, heavy with regret that came too late. She didn't come back. Instead, it was Karen who returned every morning and every evening, always at roughly the same times. She brought clean clothes, a book, sometimes soup from the cafe downstairs, even though the hospital food was technically fine. She never asked me to explain myself. Never pushed for details. She just showed up, consistent and calm, like that was the most natural thing in the world. On the third day, a social worker named Linda sat beside my bed and explained what would happen next. Temporary placement, court paperwork, evaluations, words that sounded heavy but also oddly relieving. You won't be going back to your mother's house, she said gently. I nodded, my chest tightening and loosening at the same time. Fear and relief tangled together until I couldn't tell them apart. Karen has agreed to be your temporary guardian, Linda continued, if you're comfortable with that. I turned toward Karen, startled. She met my eyes without hesitation. I offered, she said simply, no pressure. I searched her face for doubt, for hesitation, for the kind of hidden resentment I'd learned to expect from adults. I didn't find any. Yes, I said, my voice cracked. I'm comfortable. That night, after the paperwork was signed and the room went quiet again, I lay awake listening to the hum of machines and thought about the word guardian. It sounded official, protective, like something that existed to keep people from being discarded when they became inconvenient. I was discharged 2 days later. Karen drove me away from the hospital in the same car that had pulled me out of the storm. The sky was clear this time, bright in a way that felt almost insulting. The woods we passed looked harmless in daylight, ordinary. I turned my face toward the window and let myself breathe. Her house was nothing like the one I'd grown up in, smaller, quieter, full of books and plants and light, no sharp edges, no constant television noise. She showed me a bedroom at the end of the hall, already made up with clean sheets and a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. This is yours, she said, for as long as you need. For as long as you need. That sentence sat in my chest like a weight I wasn't used to carrying. Needs had always been temporary in my life, tolerated, not accommodated. I nodded because I didn't know how to respond to something so open-ended. The first night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house made me sit up. Every unfamiliar sound triggered the instinct to prepare myself, to brace for consequences. Karen didn't hover. She knocked before entering my room. She asked before touching anything, small things that added up to something enormous. The social worker visited again at the end of the week. There would be school transfers, counseling, court hearings. My mother had contested nothing. According to Linda, she'd been quiet, compliant, shaken. My brother hadn't said a word. That detail bothered me more than I expected. Not because I wanted an apology, but because his silence felt calculated, like another move in a game I had finally stepped out of. School started again 2 weeks later. New building, new teachers, new last name on the attendance sheet that didn't carry years of expectation with it. Karen walked me to the front office the first day, not hovering, but present. "If you need me, call," she said. "If you don't, that's okay too." No guilt, no obligation, just choice. I threw myself into my classes. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because learning felt safe, predictable. Answers existed. Effort mattered. For the first time, my focus was something no one could take away from me. At night, memories crept in, the sound of rain, the slam of the car door, my mother's voice telling me to get out. Karen noticed the nightmares without commenting on them directly. She'd leave tea outside my door, sit with me quietly if I asked, respect the silence if I didn't. One evening, weeks later, she asked a question that stopped me cold. "Do you want to talk about your brother?" I thought about it, about the lies, the ease with which he'd been believed, the years of watching him learn exactly how much damage he could do without consequence. "No," I said finally, "not right now." She nodded. "Then we won't." That was when I understood something important. This wasn't rescue in the dramatic sense. No speeches, no grand declarations. This was something quieter and far more powerful. Stability. Months passed. The court finalized the placement. Temporary turned into something more permanent. Karen attended my school meetings, signed permission slips, sat in the audience at a small academic awards ceremony I hadn't even told her about until the night before. She clapped anyway, like it mattered. One afternoon, while helping her organize paperwork in her home office, I noticed a framed photo on the shelf. A younger Karen, arm around a woman I didn't recognize, both smiling, both looking tired and proud at the same time. "My mentor," Karen said when she saw me looking. "She took me in when I was 17. I looked at her, surprised. "She changed my life," Karen continued. "I promised myself I'd do the same if I ever got the chance." That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let that sink in. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. It was continuity. The cycle my mother had continued was ending here, not with anger or revenge, but with interruption, with someone choosing differently. For the first time, my future didn't feel like something I had to escape into. It felt like something I was allowed to build. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was quiet, uneven, and full of moments that surprised me. By the time a year had passed, my life looked stable from the outside. Good grades, a safe home, a routine that made sense. But inside, I was still learning how to exist without waiting for the ground to disappear beneath my feet. Karen encouraged therapy, never forced it. She framed it as another tool, not a punishment, another form of education. I resisted at first, then agreed, then slowly began to understand how deeply the old patterns had shaped me. I apologized too quickly. I explained myself too much. I expected abandonment as the natural conclusion to any disagreement. Unlearning that took time. School became my anchor. I gravitated toward classes that asked hard questions, that examined systems and power and accountability. History, civics, psychology. I started to see my childhood not as a personal failure, but as something structural, a family dynamic that rewarded manipulation and punished resilience. That reframing didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. Karen noticed the shift before I did. One night at dinner, she said, "You're starting to trust your own voice." The comment startled me. I hadn't realized how quiet I'd been for so long. By 16, I was applying for academic programs I never would have dared consider before. By 17, I was accepted into a state-sponsored scholarship initiative for students from unstable home environments. Karen cried when the letter arrived. I didn't. I just stared at it, stunned by the idea that someone had read my story and said yes. My mother tried to contact me once during that time. A letter, 3 pages, apologies tangled with justification, fear wrapped in remorse. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond, not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Karen didn't push me to reconcile. She only asked one question. "What do you need to feel safe?" That question became my compass. College followed naturally, a full scholarship, a dorm room that smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Karen hugged me goodbye like a parent sending their child forward, not away. "I'm always here," she said, "but you don't need me to stand on your own." She was right. College was where I learned how to breathe without permission. I made friends slowly, carefully. I chose people who listened, people who didn't need me to be small to feel comfortable. I studied relentlessly, not out of fear, but out of purpose. I wanted to understand why some people were protected by systems while others were discarded by them. Why adults like my mother could convince themselves they were justified. Why children like me were expected to survive the consequences quietly. That curiosity turned into direction. I majored in social policy, focused my research on family systems, neglect, and long-term outcomes for abandoned youth. Professors noticed, mentors emerged, doors opened. Each opportunity felt unreal and earned at the same time. At 22, I interned with an advocacy group that worked with displaced teens. Sitting across from kids who mirrored my past was both grounding and devastating. I saw myself in their guarded expressions, their quick apologies, their disbelief when someone treated them kindly. I didn't tell them my story right away. I didn't need to. They recognized me anyway. By 26, my life was full in a way that felt intentional. I had a steady job in policy research, a small apartment, a chosen circle of people who knew my history and respected my boundaries. Karen and I talked every week. She was no longer just my guardian. She was family. That was when my mother reached out again. This time it wasn't a letter. It was a request. She wanted to meet. She wanted closure. She wanted forgiveness. She said she was ready to take responsibility now. I read the message 3 times before responding. I told her I had forgiven myself. I told her I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. I told her that forgiveness didn't require proximity. She didn't take it well. Her reply was sharp, defensive, full of the same patterns I had spent years unlearning. The same minimization, the same shifting of blame. The same insistence that time alone should erase damage. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I blocked her number. The relief was immediate and profound. Walking away that final time didn't feel like loss. It felt like completion. Like closing a door I had already walked through years ago. I went to Karen's house that evening. We sat on the porch, the air warm and still. I told her everything. She listened, then nodded once. "You chose yourself," she said. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the woods, about the rain, about the girl who had believed someone would come back for her if she waited long enough. No one did, but someone else showed up instead, someone who didn't owe me anything and chose me anyway. And in the years since, I learned something my mother never taught me. Being abandoned doesn't make you disposable. It makes you resilient. If you've ever been told you were a burden, know this. Some people mistake control for love and sacrifice for obligation. Walking away from that isn't cruelty, it's survival. And sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't confrontation, it's becoming whole without them. The past didn't stay buried just because I learned how to live without it. It resurfaced the moment my work became visible. The report I co-authored on youth displacement gained traction faster than I expected. A regional paper picked it up, then a policy journal, then an invitation to speak on a panel about family accountability and long-term outcomes for abandoned teens. My name appeared online, attached to ideas I had fought hard to articulate. That was when my mother found me again. She didn't start with a call or a letter. She started with people, distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, old neighbors, even one former teacher who sent a carefully worded message asking if everything was okay at home. At home. I recognized the pattern immediately. When control failed privately, she sought it publicly. Rewriting the story through concern, casting herself as worried, confused, desperate to reconnect with a daughter who had misunderstood everything. I ignored it. Ignoring it didn't make it stop. A week before the panel, my mother sent an email to the hosting organization. She introduced herself as my parent and asked to attend as family support. The coordinator forwarded it to me with a question mark and a gentle note asking how I'd like to proceed. My hands didn't shake when I replied. They used to. They didn't anymore. I told them no. I told them there was a restraining history. I told them to deny access. Karen called me that night. You okay? Yes, I said, surprised to find that it was true. I just need to be prepared. Prepared meant more than logistics. It meant deciding how much of my story belonged to the room and how much I would keep for myself. I didn't owe anyone catharsis. I owed myself safety. The day of the panel arrived bright and unremarkable. A university auditorium, neutral walls, microphones that worked. I wore a navy jacket and flat shoes, practical, grounded. I spoke calmly, clearly, about data, about systems, about patterns of harm that didn't look dramatic enough to trigger intervention until it was too late. I didn't mention my mother. I didn't need to. The room understood anyway. During the Q&A, a woman raised her hand, middle-aged, polite smile. What would you say to parents who feel blamed by narratives like this? She asked. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I'd say accountability isn't the same as condemnation, I replied, and discomfort is often the first sign that something needs to change. Applause followed, measured, respectful. Afterward, as people milled around, thanking me, asking questions, sharing fragments of their own stories, I saw her. My mother stood near the back of the room, partially hidden behind a pillar. She hadn't been allowed inside the panel, but she'd waited anyway. She always believed proximity counted as effort. Our eyes met. She looked older, smaller. The confidence she once wore like armor had dulled into something brittle. She stepped toward me, tentative, like I might disappear if she moved too fast. Jessica, she said, my name sounding rehearsed on her tongue. I didn't step back. I didn't step forward either. You shouldn't be here, I said calmly. I just wanted to see you, she replied quickly, to hear you speak. I'm proud of you. Pride, offered now, felt weightless, too late to anchor anything. I asked for no contact, I said. That hasn't changed. Her face tightened. I didn't abandon you, she said, the old defense slipping out before she could stop it. I was trying to teach you something. I held her gaze. You taught me exactly what I needed to learn. She flinched. You've made me look like a monster, she whispered. People are asking questions. There it was, not remorse, reputation. I didn't say your name, I replied. I told the truth. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt the old pull, the reflex to comfort, to fix, to absorb. Then I remembered the woods, the rain, the waiting. I forgive you, I said because it was true. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. She reached out, stopping inches from my arm. I'm your mother. And I'm not your burden, I said evenly. Silence stretched between us. People nearby pretended not to watch. I need you to leave, I continued. If you don't, I'll ask security to escort you out. She stared at me, searching for the girl who would have folded. She didn't find her. Without another word, she turned and walked away. I stood there until she was gone, then exhaled, not in relief, in completion. That night, I went to Karen's house. We cooked dinner together, moving easily around each other in the kitchen. When I told her what happened, she listened without interruption. "You did well," she said when I finished. "I didn't feel anything dramatic," I admitted. "No rush, no collapse." "That's what healing looks like," she replied. "It's quiet." Later, alone, I thought about the difference between being seen and being known. My mother had finally seen me, but she still didn't know me, and that was okay. I slept deeply that night, without dreams of rain or trees or waiting. For the first time in a long time, the past felt finished. Closure didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments over weeks, through consequences I never planned but no longer tried to stop. After the panel, the emails multiplied. Some were thoughtful, others clumsy, a few painfully familiar. People recognized pieces of their own lives in my work and wanted reassurance that they weren't alone. I answered what I could, redirected the rest to resources, learned how to hold empathy without surrendering myself to it. Then came the message that changed the temperature of everything. A legal notice, formal, precise. My mother was requesting mediation. She framed it as reconciliation, a chance to clarify misunderstandings and heal as a family. The wording was careful, lawyered, stripped of emotion, and heavy with implication. I read it twice and felt nothing spike, nothing sink. Just a steady awareness that this wasn't about healing. It was about control slipping beyond her reach. I declined. The response was immediate. Another message, sharper this time. She accused me of cruelty, of rewriting history, of using my story to damage hers. She said my work was harming the family name. She said I owed her privacy. Privacy, she had decided, was something I should protect for her. Karen read the messages with me at the kitchen table. She didn't comment until I finished scrolling. Then she folded her hands and said, "This is escalation." "I know," I replied. "What do you want to do?" The question mattered. Not what was expected, not what would look generous. What I wanted. "I want distance," I said, "and I want it enforced." We contacted a legal advocate. Not to threaten, to protect. Documentation, boundaries, no contact. The advocate listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and nodded more than she spoke. "This is straightforward," she said. "You're allowed to disengage." The relief was subtle but real. 2 days later, my brother reached out. It was the first time he had ever contacted me directly. His message was brief, oddly neutral, as if he were testing a line he didn't expect to hold. He said he was confused. He said our mother was struggling. He said maybe I could explain things better if we talked. I stared at the screen for a long time. In the past, this would have undone me. The familiar pressure to manage, to mediate, to soften the fallout of someone else's actions. The old reflex stirred, then settled. I didn't reply. A week later, he tried again. This time, the tone shifted. Defensive, accusatory. He implied I was exaggerating, that I was dramatic, that I'd always been sensitive. There it was, the same script, different delivery. I blocked him. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Work steadied me. Research deadlines, meetings, the slow, satisfying progress of projects that actually changed things. A new initiative was approved, one I had helped design, aimed at early intervention for teens showing signs of neglect before it escalated into crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me. At the launch meeting, a colleague leaned over and said, "You've lived this, haven't you?" "Yes," I said, "and I don't want anyone else to." Recognition came in professional forms. Invitations, collaborations, a promotion discussion that felt earned, not compensatory. My life expanded outward, not upward, filled with people who knew how to respect boundaries because they had their own. Still, the past tried one last time. My mother showed up at Karen's house. No warning, no call. Just her car at the curb on a quiet Saturday morning. I saw it through the window and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. It passed quickly. Karen didn't ask what I wanted. She already knew. She opened the door and stepped outside, closing it behind her. I watched from the hallway as they spoke in low voices. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture. My mother leaned forward, pleading. Karen stood still, unmoved. After a few minutes, Karen gestured toward the car. My mother left. Karen came back inside and met my eyes. "She won't be back," she said. I made that clear. I nodded. "Thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," she replied. "This is what protecting someone looks like." That night, we sat on the porch, the air cooling as the sun dipped low. I thought about how protection had once been framed to me as control, how sacrifice had been demanded without consent, how love had been conditional on obedience. None of that existed here. I slept deeply. In the months that followed, the attempts stopped. No more messages, no more intermediaries. The legal advocate confirmed compliance. The silence held. I noticed changes in myself, small but telling. I laughed more easily. I corrected people without apologizing. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations that would never be asked for. I was no longer bracing for the moment someone decided I was too much. One evening, Karen handed me a small box. Inside was a simple keychain, metal, unremarkable. "For your first place," she said, "whenever that happens." I turned it over in my hand, surprised by the emotion it stirred. "You don't need permission to belong anywhere," she added. I understood then that closure wasn't a conversation or an apology or a reckoning. It was a life built so solidly that the past no longer had leverage, and I was already living it. Time has a way of settling things without asking for permission. It moved forward, steady and indifferent, whether anyone was ready or not. By the time I turned 26, my life had grown into something solid, not flashy, not dramatic, just stable in the way I once believed only other people were allowed to be. I had my own apartment, a job that mattered to me, and routines that no longer felt like cages. They felt like choices. Karen and I still talked every week, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing at all. She never reminded me of what she'd done for me. She didn't need to. Her presence was woven into my life quietly, like something that had always belonged there. It was at a community forum on youth welfare that the past finally circled back one last time. I had been invited to speak about prevention strategies, about how early intervention could change outcomes long before crisis points were reached. The room was full of local officials, educators, social workers, and a handful of parents who looked both hopeful and defensive at the same time. I spoke plainly about data, about patterns, about what happens when adults dismiss warning signs because it's easier to believe one child over another. I didn't mention my mother. I didn't need to. During the break, as people clustered in small groups, Karen stood beside me, sipping coffee and listening more than she spoke. She had that effect on people. They gravitated toward her without quite knowing why. That was when I saw my mother across the room. She stood near the back, half hidden behind a display table, her posture tense and uncertain. She looked older than the last time I'd seen her, smaller somehow. The confidence she once carried like a shield had worn thin. She hadn't come for me. She'd come for Karen. I watched as my mother gathered the nerve to approach her, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Karen noticed her immediately. Their eyes met, and something unmistakable passed between them. Recognition, memory, consequence. I stayed where I was. My mother stopped a few feet away from Karen. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said, her voice unsteady. Karen tilted her head slightly. "I didn't expect you to come," she replied calmly. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. People nearby pretended not to listen. "I wanted to thank you," my mother said finally, "for helping my daughter." Karen didn't soften. She didn't bristle either. She simply nodded once. "I did what any responsible adult should have done." My mother swallowed. I was overwhelmed, she said. I made mistakes. Mistakes are accidental, Karen replied. What you did was a choice. The words weren't cruel. They were precise. My mother's shoulders sagged. She won't speak to me, she said quietly. Karen glanced toward me then, just briefly. She doesn't owe you that, she said. And she's doing well. That seemed to hurt more than anything else. Not the accusation, not the judgment. The confirmation that I had built a life without her. My mother nodded, eyes shining with unshed tears. I see that now. Karen didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. When my mother walked away, she didn't look at me. Maybe she knew better. Maybe she finally understood that proximity didn't equal access. Karen turned back to me. You okay? Yes, I said, and I meant it. The forum ended without incident. I drove home afterward, the city lights blurring softly through my windshield. I didn't feel shaken. I felt finished, like a chapter had closed without needing to be rewritten or defended. That night, I sat on my balcony and thought about the girl I had been at 15, cold, wet, waiting for someone who never came back. I wished I could tell her that the story didn't end there, that she would one day stand in rooms where her voice mattered, that she would be believed without having to beg for it. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. What surprised me most was the absence of triumph. There was no satisfaction in seeing my mother diminished, no sense of victory, just clarity. She had lost access to my life not because I punished her, but because she failed to protect me when it mattered most. That distinction changed everything. A few weeks later, I signed the lease on my own place. Small, sunlit, mine. Karen gave me the keychain she'd saved for years, the one she'd handed me long ago as a promise rather than a plan. You did this, she said, standing in the empty living room with me. I didn't do it alone, I replied. She smiled. No one ever does. As I unpacked boxes that evening, I found the old letter from my mother tucked into a drawer, the one I'd never answered. I read it once more, then folded it carefully and placed it back. It no longer held power over me. It was just a document of who she had been. I closed the drawer and turned off the light. Some people never apologize the way you need them to. Some never change. But that doesn't mean your life has to orbit their failure forever. I had learned to step out of that gravity, and in doing so, I finally understood something simple and enduring. Survival isn't the same as living. And living, once you claim it, doesn't require permission from the people who tried to leave you behind. I don't mark anniversaries anymore. Not the night in the woods. Not the day I left the hospital. Not the moment my mother walked away for good. Those dates used to feel important, like scars I needed to touch to prove they were real. Now they're just part of the landscape behind me. I know where I came from. I don't need to keep standing there to remember it. What I do remember, clearly and without pain, is the first morning I woke up in my own place and realized no one was going to take it away from me. The light came through the window at an angle I hadn't seen before. The air was quiet, safe. I made coffee and stood there barefoot, listening to nothing but my own breathing. That was the moment I understood something had truly changed. Not because I had succeeded, not because anyone had apologized, but because I no longer felt the need to brace myself. Karen came over later that day with a small plant and a bag of groceries I hadn't asked for. She always did things like that, never in a way that suggested I couldn't manage on my own, just in a way that said I wasn't alone. We cooked dinner together, moved around the kitchen easily, like people who trusted the space they shared. You've built a good life, she said casually, stirring a pot. I nodded. I know. There was a time when saying that out loud would have felt like tempting fate, like daring the universe to prove me wrong. Now it felt factual, grounded. My work continued to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. Projects expanded, younger colleagues sought my input, students reached out after talks to say they felt seen for the first time. Every time that happened, I thought about how close I'd come to disappearing quietly, how easily my story could have ended differently. That awareness never turned into bitterness, it turned into purpose. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need public vindication. The truth had already done its work. My mother remained absent. Not dramatically, not with finality, just consistently. Occasionally, I heard updates through distant connections. She'd downsized, changed jobs, become quieter. People said she seemed humbled. I didn't investigate further. Her inner life was no longer my responsibility. My brother faded from my thoughts almost entirely. Not because I forgave him in some grand emotional way, but because he stopped occupying space in my mind. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always feel like release. Sometimes it feels like indifference. And that's okay. On a cool evening not long ago, Karen and I sat on the same porch where we'd once talked about boundaries and survival. The air smelled like rain, but the sky was clear. I mentioned the woods, casually, like a place I'd visited long ago rather than something that once nearly swallowed me whole. She listened, then said something that stayed with me. People think abandonment is the worst thing that can happen to a child, she said. But being kept without being loved can be just as damaging. She was right. I hadn't just been abandoned that night. I had been discarded emotionally for years before anyone put me in a car and drove me into the dark. The woods were only the visible ending of something that had been happening quietly all along. Understanding that freed me from one last illusion. My survival wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck alone. It was the result of someone choosing to intervene when silence would have been easier. And then later, the result of me choosing to keep going when it would have been tempting to shrink myself to fit someone else's comfort. I don't hate my mother. I don't miss her either. What I feel now is something steadier. Respect for myself. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel like a burden, especially by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to hear this clearly. Their inability to love you properly is not a measure of your worth. It's a reflection of their limits. You don't owe endless chances to people who hurt you and refuse to change. You don't owe access to your life just because someone shares your blood. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't confrontation. It's walking away and building something better without asking for permission. That night in the woods, I thought I was being thrown away. I wasn't. I was being forced into a beginning I couldn't see yet. If this story resonated with you, if parts of it felt uncomfortably familiar, I'd love to hear from you. You're not alone in this, even if it feels that way right now. Leave a comment, share what stood out to you, or simply let me know you were here listening. And if you want to hear more stories about resilience, boundaries, and what it really means to reclaim your life after family betrayal, consider staying with the channel and subscribing. These stories exist because people like you need to know that survival can turn into something more. Take care of yourself. And remember, you get to decide who has a place in your life. This story is fictionalized for a dramatic effect.